So as Daniela mentioned, this is a joint work with Andrew, who unfortunately cannot be here today, but I mean, I will report all your comments to him. So the motivation for this paper is that, as you are all probably aware, in the past, particularly by past we mean particularly during the so-called refugee crisis in 2015 and a little bit afterwards, Western European countries appeared to be more pro-immigration, whereas Central and Eastern European countries very much more negative. And this was generally attributed to actual lower levels of migration in Central and Eastern Europe, so that people did not have this contact with actual refugees and or migrants. And but this, with the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, changed, because basically Central Eastern Europe is now a key destination for displaced Ukrainians. So the roles reversed a little bit. And so in this paper particularly, we want to contribute by making two contributions. First of all, we want to look at the drivers of attitudes to migrations and refugees after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and whether there are differences between Western and Central Eastern part of Europe. And also we want to look at the effect of external threats on group identities and attitudes to immigration, and whether there are actually individual level differences based also on who are the refugees. And we ask whether these are also based on geopolitical and historical dynamics. So we know from previous research that opposition to migration and refugees actually is due to also who are the immigrants. So some type of immigrants are accepted more than others. This is usually, it has been shown, it's based on ethnicity and also on religious affiliation. So with Christian white immigrants or refugees being accepted much more than, for example, Muslim refugees. What we also know, and this was especially the work by Bansak and their conjoint experiment, they actually also show that asylum seekers are accepted much more based on the evaluation of their potential economic contribution, whether they are seen as genuine refugees, so whether they are actually seen as someone really escaping a conflict, and whether they deserve to be refugees somewhat. And it is also the acceptance of asylum seekers is kind of affected by the anti-Muslim bias. And this all also plays into this social identity theory, where with in-group and out-group, where of course people accept much more groups that are seen as similar to them compared to those that are considered an out-group. So this is what we know already from the literature, and our argument here in this paper is that we also know that opposition to migrants and refugees is usually generated by threat perceptions. So threat leads to more negative attitudes towards refugees and others that are considered an out group, whoever these are. But our argument here is that in the specific case of an existential threat, this actually has a positive effect on attitudes to migration and attitudes to refugees. So although there are actually ethnic cues that have an effect, we know that from the previous literature, and I will show also in this presentation, we also find this in our data. We argue that the acceptance of Ukrainians, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, is not only based on the co-ethnicity of these refugees with the people in the Central Eastern European countries, but it's also driven by the perception of Russian threat. So, so our first research question actually asked, to what extent do European citizens have different attitudes based on the group status of asylum seekers? So we want to know, we want to confirm whether these ethnic cues are still valid here in the particular case of Ukrainian refugees. And we do this by, and I will talk about this a little bit in a moment, by a survey experiment where actually we compare attitudes to Syrian refugees and Ukrainian refugees. And so we argue that, or we expect that Ukrainians will be more accepted than Syrians in all the countries, and we also expect that the aggregate levels of positive attitudes towards Ukraine will be actually much more stronger in the 5 Central Eastern European countries that we have in our sample compared to Western European countries, which is Germany, Italy, and Austria. And our second research question asks, to what extent does the perception of Russian threat affect these attitudes, especially in Central and Eastern Europe? And we expect that the Russian threat perception will have a positive effect on attitudes towards Ukrainians, but we do not expect this to be the case with Syrians. So how do we do this? We actually at the Migration Policy Center, we actually commissioned 2 online surveys. One was conducted last year between May and June, and the second round was conducted this year in April. It is not a panel, so as the same as we saw this morning, it's a fresh sample. So we cannot see how these respondents, like particular people, change their opinion. So we have 8 EU countries. We have Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, Italy, Romania, Slovakia, Austria, and Hungary. And in each, we have roughly 1,000 respondents, a nationally representative sample. So this is just a kind of like more descriptive. So what you see is that in general, I would say that there is quite an overwhelmingly positive attitude towards Ukrainian refugees in all countries, because even in the most negative countries, which last year was Slovakia and this year is Romania, the percentages are pretty low. It's only around roughly 10% would not allow any Ukrainian refugees to come and live in the country. And you can see in all the other countries are even more positive. So this is not something we are that much interested in this paper. So this is just a comparison between last year and this year. So what we see is there's a slightly more, the support is going a little bit down, but especially, for example, in Poland. But on the other hand, as you can tell, the support was overwhelming last year. More than 80% of polls would actually allow many or some Ukrainians to come to the country, which so I would not interpret this as some kind of like effect going away. But what we were mostly, as I mentioned, what we were mostly interested here is looking at whether Ukrainians are accepted in a different way than other refugee groups. So what we did is a so-called survey experiment, where basically you ask half of your sample a question about Ukrainians, and you ask the other half about Syrians, and this way, because the respondents are separated into 2 groups completely randomly, and you kind of know that the 2 groups do not differ in any particular way. So it's not 2 men, so in one group a man and one group woman. So it's a very, there is this randomization, and this way you actually can really attribute a causal effect to your results, because the randomization ensures this. So here you see attitudes to Syrian refugees, and as you can tell, we saw the negative was around 10% in the most negative countries. With Ukrainians here, it's almost 30% in the most negative countries. So there's a clear difference whether people would accept Ukrainians or Syrians. So that was just kind of some descriptives, but we also actually did a t-test where we compared the means for the acceptance of the 2 refugee groups. And in both years and in all countries, there were actually statistically significant differences where Ukrainians were much more accepted than compared to Syrians, except for Italy in 2023, when there was no statistical difference between the two groups. But the differences were also much more pronounced in Central and Eastern Europe than in the Western European countries. This is actually these are the predicted probabilities for, you can see on the left-hand side, it's 2022 and 2023, just to show that basically we see the same patterns in both years. So things don't change much. So here you can tell in all countries, Ukrainian refugees are much more accepted than Syrian refugees. So from this, we conclude that actually our hypothesis 1 is confirmed, because we see in both years that there are statistically significant differences in acceptance, and that also these differences are much pronounced in Central and Eastern Europe. And now we come to the most interesting, in my opinion, part about how does an external threat to Europe affect attitudes to refugees. So our argument is also placed into the social identities theory, basically strengthening the in-group solidarity and differentiating ourselves from the out-group. In this case, of course, the in-group would be Ukrainians and the out-group would be the Russians. And in general, this is just so these are factors that we also hypothesize affect attitudes towards refugees in general. You can also see that they mostly play the same way for both refugee groups. So there's not much difference in so people who consume media more are actually more pro-refugees. People who have an exclusive national identity are much significantly less likely to want to accept refugees. And so the only thing that plays a little bit differently is gender here, where women are actually significantly more negative compared to men in accepting Ukrainian refugees, but there is no gender difference with regard to Syrian refugees. And but what we are most interested in, yeah, it's yeah, exactly. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mention. So these are because our dependent variable is actually an ordinal variable. So it is, so we do a ordered logit model, and these are odds ratios, which are easier to interpret. So exactly, and everything what you see on the right-hand side of the red line is has a positive effect on accepting refugees, and everything on the left-hand side has a negative, and everything that touches the red line is insignificant. So yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned this before. So, but now this is our most important independent variable, which is the perception of Russia as a threat. And I left it here also in the last model. We control, of course, for country fixed effect and also for the year of the survey. Here I also left it, so just to show you that basically this year, the attitudes towards both types of refugees are significantly lower than they used to be last year. But as you can see here, we see the Russian threat being the variable that has the most effect in explaining attitudes towards Ukrainian refugees. But it's not, it's almost not significant for Syrian refugees. So the Russian threat plays only for Ukrainians, but not for Syrians. And this is something that wasn't in the paper, but I just added yesterday to the presentation, because it kind of strengthens our argument. So here I also included in the models other threat perceptions. So these are actually the variables that Alina uses as well. So these are variables that asks about whether you consider immigration good or bad for your country in general, whether you consider immigration good or bad for the economy of your country and for the culture of your country. So basically, here it is coded that people who do consider immigration being very bad for economy, culture, or the country, you can see that it has a very negative effect on allowing refugees into the country. but Russian threat plays differently for Ukrainians. So that has a very overwhelmingly positive effect on allowing only Ukrainian refugees, not Syrians. So this is actually country by country, and you can see here this it's a kind of like so in many countries it plays how we would expect, but for example Germany, as you can see, makes absolutely no difference between Ukrainians and Syrians with regard to Russian threat. So if you feel threatened by Russia, you are also more significantly likely to accept Syrian refugees, not only Ukrainians. In Poland, we see a significantly negative effect, and my explanation here would be that it has something to do with the crisis at the Belarusian border. So they see kind of Russia interfering with these Middle Eastern refugees and playing this. So this would be my interpretation why we see this effect. And Hungary has, I don't know what's happening there, to be completely honest with you. So if anyone has an explanation, because what this shows is actually that if you feel Russia as a threat, you're more likely to accept Syrians. I mean, it has more effect. No, it has a Russian threat has more effect for Syrians compared to Ukrainians. So, and yeah, so this is just something like probably in the paper, we don't want to play too much into this disintegration, because we see that it's a little bit hard to interpret what's going on in every particular country, but we see a lot of Czech Republic and Austria and everyone like doing what we would expect. So Russian threat has an effect on acceptance of Ukrainian refugees, and it has no effect on Syrian refugees. So this kind of would support our argument. So so just to conclude, so in both ways, we actually do find, I would call it an overwhelming support for displaced Ukrainians. We also by our survey experiment actually show the importance of group cues, which is something that confirms the previous literature and the work that has been done before. But we also on the other hand, what I see as our contribution is that actually the situation that happened last year, which is huge influx of Ukrainian refugees into especially Central and Eastern Europe, this should normally have a negative effect, because people are actually now there are real, not like in the so-called migration crisis in 2015, when the refugees were just imagined and there were not actually any refugees in these countries, or very little. This time this is actually happening. So why does it not have the same effect as it had in the during the migration crisis in 2015? And our explanation would be that is the perception of Russian threat that explains this. So I stop here, and I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you.